What is up, everyone? Ben here, and today we are going to be going over an ATHLEAN X biceps specific video. This is a video I believe that is dedicated to picking up the sort of lagging body part idea specific to the biceps. And so we're going to kind of go through this video, talk about some of the things that maybe make a little bit more sense and some of the things that maybe don't. And yeah, let's just jump right into it.
What's up, guys? Jeff Cavalier, ATHLEANX.com. So if you've got smaller biceps or lagging biceps and you want to do something about it, I'm going to show you today exactly what to do. Now, let's do this together, okay? Because I'm going to make this an interactive video because I want you to feel this right away and see what the problem is so you can become more aware of how to fix it. First thing.
All right, so I haven't really seen this video the full way through, but just given the fact that he's not actually starting to talk about exercises, I'm going to guess that he's going to start to talk about some sort of like, you need to get better at squeezing your bicep sort of a thing.
What we're going to do, I want you to take your arm right here and put it at your side and squeeze. Okay, I want you to flex your bicep as hard as you possibly can. Do you feel any discomfort here? Okay, just make note. Do you have any discomfort in your bicep? I can tell you I actually have some discomfort here, right? But now we can make it more intense. Bring that arm out in front of your body a little bit more and then supinate the wrist. Okay, so now when I squeeze, you can see this thing.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know what supinate means, which is a forearm action, it's not a wrist action. Forearm action is when you actually just basically turn your palm. In this case, if you're just holding your hand up, it's toward your face and away from your face. Obviously, that can change depending on where your shoulder is. If your shoulder's all the way out here, that's not toward and away from your face, so it's not relative to your face. It's relative to the actions at the forearm, but in this specific case, when you're doing a curl, it just basically means more palm to face.
Things are almost ready to pop, right? But the fact is, you may not be feeling much. I mean, I want you to actually feel like a contraction discomfort where you really don't want to hold this that much more. Okay, if you don't feel it here, you've got problems, okay?
Okay, so a couple things to address here. So first of all, when we are talking about sensation during exercise or sensation during not exercise, as is demonstrated in this particular case, we're talking about a very complex, multifactorial, subjective perception, right? Which is a more complicated way of saying we're talking about something that we can describe only through experience, number one, and number two, with probably little accuracy as to what's specifically going on in regards to the sensation. So you could be feeling a specific sensation in your stomach, right? And you wouldn't necessarily look at that as a good thing. You could be feeling a specific sensation in sort of more of the deep parts of the joint, right? In the deep parts of the shoulder or in the elbow or in the hip. And you also wouldn't call that a good thing. So I think we need to kind of get away from this idea that's just specific to muscles. Sensation is a good thing. We need to start to question, whether or not that's something that we actually want. And in a lot of cases, I find that is something that we don't. Take, for example, the highest level powerlifters in the world who are lifting the heaviest weights that ever have been lifted. Those are people who during the actual lifts report basically feeling nothing specific to muscle contraction, when in reality, like, they're the people that are lifting the heaviest weights of all time. So that should be something that kind of rings a bell. Obviously, the kind of movement that they're doing and the specific joint angles and the specific rep ranges are different, and so that will inherently make things a little bit different. But just kind of food for thought is that sensation needs to be this thing that is looked at as sort of the end result of confounding variables and not just one single thing that we like to think is actually happening.
They're worse than if you don't feel it here. Some guys won't feel it here. If you don't feel it here, you have problems. Now, we go to stage 3, and I bring it all the way up as if I'm going to flex my arm up here. And again, I'm twisting, I'm supinating, and I'm squeezing as hard as I possibly can. Now, this is very, very, very uncomfortable for me.
All right, so just a couple things now, since we progressed another layer up, is basically what Jeff is doing is he's working himself into a progressively more flexed and abducted position. So for those of you who don't know, abduction, abduction is basically just motion away from the body. So that can be horizontal, or that could also be straight out to the side, and this more in line with the body plane. And so what he's doing basically as he raises his shoulder is he's keeping his elbow bent. So from the perspective of the elbow, the biceps are contracted, they're more shortened. But from the perspective of the shoulder, because both biceps do cross the shoulder, if you have the arm lower down to the side, they're more lengthened at the shoulder, right? So the total length of the muscle isn't completely shortened. The total length of the muscle only gets completely shortened when you actually start to raise your shoulder up in some way. It can be a little bit up and sort of inward. It can also be in and a little bit outward, and those would shorten the two heads of the biceps a little bit differently. But from the perspective of the position that Jeff has here, he's really, really shortening, especially that long head of the biceps. And when you progressively shorten a muscle more, because there are more active components of the contraction that are, we'll say, in place as opposed to passive, right? Passive would be more if you were in like a lengthened position. Typically speaking, people get more sensation when they have to encounter a situation where they're lifting through more active elements of the contraction. That's a little bit more physiology-based stuff that we don't have to get into today. But from the perspective of whether you're going to feel more sensation in a more shortened position or a more lengthened position, you're absolutely going to feel more sensation in a more shortened position, like the position that Jeff is showing here. So it makes complete sense that you're going to feel more sensation up here than down here. That pretty much applies to every single muscle. If you want to think about a related example, just think about the quadriceps, right? And think about the difference between how much you feel your quads being squeezed at the bottom of a squat, right? Which generally speaking is not very much, versus how much you feel your quads being squeezed in a leg extension, right? That's basically the difference in position that we're comparing here when we have the arm low as compared to when we have the arm high. So this whole idea of sensation will be different by nature of the position that you're actually trying to get yourself into and train during these exercises. So it's not just something that you mentally will to have happen. Oftentimes it's a huge product of the position that you're training and also the way that you're training, and specifically in terms of the range that you're using. But we'll get into that later probably.
If this is not uncomfortable for you to the point where you actually have to stop because it's starting to cramp up.
Again, this whole discomfort thing, not necessarily something that we need to chase, at least in this specific case.
Then I've identified your problem for you. What it means is you do not have a good mind-muscle connection with that muscle. You might have heard that term thrown around before, and some guys even refer to it in PubMed studies ridiculously. The fact is, it actually matters. It matters a lot, because if you can't feel the muscle contract.
So Jeff just kind of briefly tries to brush over the fact that people in PubMed studies refer to this ridiculously, but all of the current bodies of research related to mind-muscle connection have shown that mind-muscle connection is, in many cases, in terms of people trying to create an internal focus of control versus an external focus of control. So, you know, an example during a curl would be like an external focus would be like move my hand to my shoulder, and an internal focus would be like squeeze my biceps. Oftentimes they found more activation with the internal squeeze my biceps control, but they actually found lower amounts of force output and actually lower amounts of weight lifted for fewer reps with the internal focus of control. So that should actually tell you something very clearly, which is that oftentimes the body is going to organize more appropriately around the physics of the exercise, as opposed to how much you are mentally willing yourself to do something. A lot of times that can work against us. And EMG research is a host of complications, but this is just one area where EMG research really sort of has been clear, especially over the last decade or so, that the sort of internal focus, the mind-muscle connection thing is not as powerful or as useful as we once maybe thought.
Then what is the additional work going to do? Go back to a scenario someone might have told you, do specialization work. Do an extra bicep specialization day in your training. What good is it? You can do all the specialization work you want, the additional bicep curls and concentration curls and whatever. If you don't have a good connection with the muscle, you think it's going to respond?
Yes, I do think it will respond because 99% of the time the problem is the setup and the execution of the movements, not necessarily the fact that you can't have a conversation with your biceps.
You would have been better off actually doing more volume in the form of maybe another pull day, maybe a lighter pull day where you can get at least some side benefits for your back by doing actually weighted chins or underhand rows, right? But not through additional specialization because it's not working. But it doesn't mean that specialization won't work if you first develop that mind-muscle connection. So
I've literally never seen an individual train arms 2 or 3 times a week eating in a calorie surplus and not grow their arms. And I've literally never seen it in a client.
All you have to do, okay? Follow along with me here. What you want to do is you want to start, again, 2 or 3 times a week. And I'm going to explain why you can tolerate this kind of volume without any repercussions. You're going to grab a pair of dumbbells, and you're going to put them and almost mimic that sequence once again. So you put them at your side here as if you're doing that mid portion of a curl. And what you want to do is squeeze as hard as you can for 45 seconds and go through just a small little pulsing contraction up and down, an inch up and an inch down. Okay, with the goal being to see if you can intensify that contraction to start to feel some discomfort in there with the use of the weight. Now, the weight does not have to be heavy. You can use very light weights here. It's just a fact to put yourself in a position to mimic the same action I had you go through before.
Okay, so from just a little bit of the physics conversation is important to talk about here. The position that you'll feel the most amount of sensation in generally in an exercise is the position that there's the most amount of resistance in. And resistance is a product of a couple of things. One of them is weight, but one of them is also distance. So when Jeff is sort of statically holding this position at 90 degrees of, or roughly 90 degrees of elbow flexion, i.e. his elbow is bent to about a right angle, he is putting himself in the portion of the curl that is most mechanically difficult. This also happens to coincide from a strength profile standpoint with where the biceps are strongest. So couple the weight being heaviest where the muscles tend to be stronger, and you got a lot of sensation. So it's a great position to just feel sensation, and you'll get a lot of sensation doing this. But there's about a total of 0 reasons to do this necessarily over another variant that would just be a little bit more easy to set up, stabilize, and control, where you're actually moving through the entirety of the range of motion through full elbow extension or elbow straightening and full elbow flexion, elbow bending instead. So I have qualms with this, to say the least.
Now after that, you do that 2 times for 45 seconds. The next thing you do is you want to get into a position or an exercise that sort of mimics that secondary position, which is the arm out in front of the body, a little bit more supination. And we could do that with a spider curl position that you see me here. Now the same thing applies here. I'm going to get up into that position.
Okay, so this is kind of mimicking that shorter position of the biceps he talked about earlier, and pretty similar from the perspective of joint angle and where it's being heavy. Imagine if you were to just kind of hang with his elbow straight and just do the bottom portion of the range. All of you would intuitively know that, like, hey, it wouldn't actually really be that heavy on my elbow. So this is yet again something that is like, okay, no, spider curl, decent exercise, not a terrible exercise, but like, why wouldn't you just rather go through the full range and maybe just do pauses at the top if you felt like you had poor control in the shortened position? You're missing out on the most beneficial portion of the range from a hypertrophy perspective, which is, as we know, again, through what has repeatedly shown to come up in the literature as the most important part of the range for training for hypertrophy tends to be the more stretched, the more lengthened position. So avoiding that fully elbow straightened position is a bad idea for biceps growth, or really growth of any tissue, to put it generally.
Get to a contraction, have the forearm supinated, squeeze as hard as I possibly can, hope to feel more discomfort, and pulse a little bit in that top position. Up and down, just an inch up and an inch down. Again, the weights are secondary here. They do not have to be that heavy. You're going for that connection.
So something I do appreciate that Jeff has always preached, at least as far as I have seen, is that the dumbbells or the weights in your hands are not necessarily the most important things. And like I mentioned earlier, that the resistance you experience is both a product of the weight and other things like how far the weight is from a joint and how well you control the weight and all of those things. But again, my comments kind of remain the same as earlier.
Between your brain and that muscle, in this case the biceps. Again, 45 seconds twice. Then finally we're going to grab either a band if you're going to be training at home or a cable machine if you're training in the gym. You want to mimic that same last position, which was basically that bicep flex position. So we're going to do the cable curl down to a flex position here. And when you have it there, you want to...
All right, so same thing. Like I love this exercise. I do this exercise a lot. I have clients do this exercise very frequently. I would just train the full range.
Go pulse again, once again, up an inch and down an inch, for another 45 seconds per arm. Now, if you do this whole thing, it only comes out to be about 6 minutes of activation work.
Activation work, and generally speaking, the term activation is something I have or take issue with, because it's kind of like, well, if the exercises that you're choosing to do in the gym aren't activating the tissues that you're trying to train, then the solution would not be to add an exercise before those exercises that activates the tissue, because the tissue is active if it can move the joint, but rather just to improve the setup of the actual exercises that you're doing.
I know I did a sore in 6 minutes series before, but let's call this the size in 6 minutes. Now, don't be confused. This is not a size building activity here. It's not. We're talking about isometrics and light dumbbells. What this is the activation necessary to unlock the size. So if you do go back to doing specialization bicep work, it actually might work now. You're able to do it 2 or 3 times a week. Additionally, number 1, because it's short. Number 2, you don't have any eccentric overload here. Number 3, you're not getting a whole hell of a lot of metabolic buildup. So these methods that might...
I don't think that the claim that you're not getting a lot of metabolic buildup is necessarily supported. And if anything, based on what I've seen, short position training, which is basically what he's doing, is actually the most metabolically taxing. All right, so overall, I would just have a number of different things to say amongst the rest of the stuff that I've said so far, which is primarily about this idea of the mind-muscle connection. So I do think that the mind-muscle connection is valuable in some sense, but just not in the sense that I think most people traditionally think of it as valuable in. So for example, I think most people will sort of conceptualize the mind-muscle connection as this thing where you think about the tissue, you squeeze the shit out of the tissue, and then the tissue contracts and it does more work. But oftentimes, and many of you can just test this yourself, like go ahead and just go through the contraction sequence with your biceps, as Jeff kind of walked through in the beginning of this video, and just feel your triceps, like feel what happens in the opposing muscle group. And what you'll notice oftentimes is that you can't actually contract your biceps very hard or get that discomfort without also contracting, co-contracting at the same time the antagonist muscle group, i.e. the muscle group that literally fights the group that you're squeezing. So oftentimes when we do the squeezing thing, we actually have a concomitant contraction in the opposite muscle group, i.e. if I squeeze my lat, my pec will also squeeze. If I squeeze my delt, my teres will also squeeze. If I squeeze my biceps, my triceps will also squeeze. If I squeeze my quads, oftentimes my hamstrings also do the same. And this is all mechanistically appropriate, neuromuscularly appropriate, to be able to coordinate contraction around joints. This is how we keep our joints stable when we move. It's not a bad thing necessarily, but when we're training through resistance exercise activities like a dumbbell biceps curl, we want to keep in mind that our goal isn't to create contraction in the triceps, right? So if you have this mental sort of intent to actually create a ton of contraction in the biceps, oftentimes what will happen is your triceps will co-contract and you will get this great amount of sensation, which is basically your body's way of telling you, hey, you are contracting 2 tissues that are trying to do the opposite thing right now. What the heck is going on? So from the standpoint of like how I would sort of make a few additions and changes to this idea is set the exercises up properly. Oftentimes all that means is just understanding the function of the joint and the direction of the fibers that you're trying to train, the muscle fibers. And then use enough external constraints, especially at first when you're trying to learn an exercise, so that you're able to actually minimize the amount of things that you have to manage. So for instance, if you're struggling with biceps training specifically, what I would highly recommend is to start with something like simply a dumbbell preacher curl, single arm dumbbell or machine preacher curl, where you have a lot of external constraints surrounding you. You have a ton of reference to actually put your arm up against to start to notice, hey, is my shoulder moving a lot? Am I actually controlling the weight? Am I letting it drop? You can start to pay more attention to those kinds of things because you are more externally constrained and stabilized, and you don't have to worry about managing the position of your body, all the things that basically don't have a direct relation to what's happening at the elbow joint. Now, what I would also say is eventually you would want to get to a point where you can do exercises like cable curls and dumbbell curls, maybe in a more freestanding way. But first, it's extremely helpful to be able to have that constraint so that you can have reference to actually learn the movement. And hell, for instance, like some of you may just end up doing the dumbbell preacher curl forever. It's a great exercise and it's externally stabilized. And that provides a good constraint, like I said. So what I would highly recommend is just slowing down the motions that you're already doing. If you're using way more weight than you should be, drop the weight, move a little bit slower. Again, utilize those strategies that I mentioned, like adding the external constraints, and you should be pretty good to go. So overall, hopefully all of you enjoyed or got something out of that. And if you enjoyed this, please share it, please like it, please comment and let me know. I will continue to do more of these. So see you all in the next one.